as promised, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about negotiations. And so this is a really, I'm going to share my monitor here. Um, let's see. I'm getting that monitor together for us so I can share that with us. Let's see here, Marilyn. There we go. Okay, so let's talk about this. Let's talk about negotiations. And I wanted to do this because it is just so important what I saw going on. So, negotiations. Who negotiates? Whether we're negotiating a salary, a deal with a supplier, or a flexible work arrangements, we need to go in prepared, right? And so otherwise, we risk not getting the things we want and need. So the most important factors to consider ahead of time, what are they? When and if ever should we reveal to the other party our priorities and terms that we absolutely can't agree to? That's another thing we want to talk about here. And then advocating and bargaining for ourselves and our employees or our businesses can feel so personal to each of us and how we manage the emotions that come with it. So let's get started. So there's some principles and tactics of negotiations. As an entrepreneur, for me, negotiation is an everyday practice. From job offers to parental leave to asking for any type of leave from work, all of these concern negotiations. And so, in order to do them, we must know how to master asking for what it is we want. And a lot of people are very fearful of negotiations, but they shouldn't be because, again, negotiations is part of everyday life. So negotiations is interdependent. And what do I mean by that? Interdependent means that we're unable to participate without someone else, meaning in order to negotiate, there must be another party that needs or wants something, or that we need that want something from. And the decision making, meaning the process by which we choose an option from the available alternatives. Now, this concept of interdependent decision making encompasses several different types of scenarios. So, I'm going to talk about me as a small business and use myself as a base. So, as a small business owner, you have to be involved with many different levels of negotiation with different demographics of people. I have to or sell my services either for consulting, education, or security. Those are businesses that I operate under my company. There's a process I must go through. There are many ways that works with pricing and logistics, the organization size that I'm working with, whether it's a film company or location managers, movie studios, location services, state or local agencies, and competition. Whether it's a business organization or a hospital institution, I have to do negotiations, and my team has to go through negotiations. Even as a professor, I have to go through negotiations with the companies I am teaching for or designing course curriculum for. Employees, partnership arrangements, and local and state police departments are others that I have to negotiate with, especially when it comes to a movie set or my group has to negotiate with. So as you can see, as an entrepreneur, I'm always in a state of negotiations. And so that hat is always on. So there are different types of negotiations. And some negotiations are distributed in whereby the goal is to claim value. Others are integrative in nature, whereby the goal is to create value and then claim value. Now, some negotiations are transaction based, and that's where you want to make the deal. And other negotiations, it's not about the transaction, it's about more the conflicts and disputes and the disagreement of ideas in those negotiations. And what I mean by that, disagreement of ideas. It could be like with a company or a personal disagreement of ideas between in a relationship, of personal relationship or a business relationship. So it's very important to build relationships that are very important to me in running my small business. So when I went to meet with the movie executives to bid on the business, I went prepared with possible presentation, professionals from the industry, as well as a strategy. And when I first went in, I was really going in to offer HR services to them. And but what I walked out with was more than what I went in for. And so once the negotiation occurs in phases. Yes, it doesn't happen all at once. Like I said, I went in for one thing to help with the staffing, and I came out with something else. And the phases that can be, a lot of negotiation phases can be short or they can be long, but it depends on the type of negotiation that we're walking into. In my case, I was walking into something that I thought was going to be short. I was going to fulfill the staffing and then I was going to walk away. So my first movie was Godzilla. And in Godzilla, I walked out of the room with more than and offering them other things that they needed because I had worked in the area for quite some time. I walked out with a whole contract for security rather than staffing the security team. And the goal of that negotiation was to do one thing, but when I walked away with a full-fledged relationship that continues to this day. And sometimes that first phase of building rapport can last 5 minutes. Sometimes it can last for months, just trying to make sure that you have had this certain level of trust. And that's what happened with me. The company built a certain level of trust in me, or the executive producers built a certain level of trust in me and the staff that I have on hand. They liked that and they wanted to continue on. So before the transaction can even take place, you're in recognizing that most importantly, communicating properly and upfront, I think helps to manage the process quite well in any negotiation process. So I had to engage and talk for about 2 hours, thinking that I would have a deal at the end of those 2 hours. That may have been very frustrating, but I didn't think I'd have a deal. I was just there to offer something. And I didn't have passion or emotions put into it. I had passion of wanting the deal, but I didn't have emotions that if I don't get it, something else was going to happen or I was going to starve to death or anything like that. Because I already had something else. I was just trying to fulfill a need that the company had at the moment. All right. So process. What's the process in negotiation processes? Because they initially said, look, let me tell you about the process. This is probably not going to be a big deal today. Then I said, okay, in this particular thing, no pressure, pressure's off. We're just sharing information, which we were there for. But once they shared that information and provided that, I got a lot more deeper and I was able to offer additional things that they didn't think that I would be able to offer or I was there to offer to them. So in the negotiation process, it takes a lot of preparation. A good negotiator is a prepared negotiator. And preparation begins prior to the negotiation, not necessarily at the negotiation table. So if thinking about what you could do prior to the negotiation is exceptionally important. Another good way is what we call a planning document. So you write down those things that are extremely important to you. What are your goals? What are your alternatives? And how are you going to be in this negotiation? So documentation and reflection. So documenting that and reflecting on that can be the exceptionally important tool to prepare for the negotiation. And so a good planning document, it can help minimize the anxiety, increase the confidence, minimize gaps or negotiations at the negotiation table. So it's a written record that documents some of the most important issues before the negotiation. That's documentation. So thinking about these issues before the negotiation puts you in a better place to manage that overall negotiation process. And you may even go so far as to actually negotiate and map out that process that you were talking about. So, this is the first meeting, and in this meeting, we want to accomplish this. So, you want to make sure of these things. All right, so phase two, this is the next meeting. So, a good negotiator is a prepared negotiator, remember? So, distributive or integrative negotiations. First, we diagnose the type of negotiations we're doing. So, this is a distributive where I'm trying to get the most for myself. That's distributive negotiation. Is it integrative, where we're both trying to get something and create value? So, first, diagnose the type of negotiation. That's what you have to do first. Then, once you diagnose the type of negotiation, then that's going to dictate the types of questions that you might want to consider. So, let's discuss the basics in your negotiation process. There's some very basics in there. Number one, so listing all the issues. You got to know what your issues are. Then going back and ranking those issues on a piece of paper that you have, the issues that you're up against. What are the absolute most important for you to have in this negotiation? And which ones would you be willing to give on? And this is great when asking for a raise or anything. You could try this whole process and use it for anything that you're trying to negotiate. I also mentioned the notion of target, and that is, in a perfect world, this is my ideal target that I'm going for. I would like to walk away from this agreement, and this would make me exceptionally happy. What would make you exceptionally happy in that negotiation? But you also want to include in that document, all right, that's my target, but these are some things that I may not need, but this is what I must have. But what's the least among that I'm willing to accept? What is the least thing that you're willing to accept in that negotiation before walking away? Then you also need to fundamentally know, if I don't get the deal here, what am I going to do? So know what you're going to do. Don't just talk about game. Know what you're there for. So what about your alternatives? So number one, you need to know what you want to walk away to make sure that you don't take something subpar in the negotiation, right? It's like buying a car. What is it that you don't want to walk away from? What are you saying? What is your absolutely most or least that you're willing to accept? And the stronger that alternative is, the better the negotiation tends to be. So those alternatives do matter. Because you have to really strong, because you have a really strong alternative, you push really hard in that negotiation because you're not going to take anything less. So your alternatives is your strong backup, right? So if I was negotiating a salary increase or promotion, I know what I'm not willing to accept and what I'm willing to go for. So I have my top and I have my alternative. And so knowing what my top is, then and understanding what the alternative may be is ideal. So when your alternative is a bit weak, right? Then you won't quite have as much power because you're not walking away with anything that you wanted. So focus on the opposing party. So if you think about what your goal is, what is their goal? What is your manager's goal? What is your manager trying to accomplish? Or what is the person trying to accomplish, or the big things for them? So you got to know some things. You just can't guess and sit back in the shade or in the corner and think about what you know. You got to kind of know what's going on. So if you think about what your alternative is, what you have to walk away to, what is it that you have to walk away with? So as we continue thinking about the alternative, if you think about what's most important issues are and what are theirs, know what theirs are, know what yours are. And then you use the negotiation process to go through a diagnostic to see about what is it that I thought about ahead of time, and is this true? Because guess what? They're trying to guess what the least amount is that you're trying to get. And you're trying to get what the most amount is that they're trying to pay, right? So everybody's on a track and trying to figure out what's going on. So Giving that information and think about the whole process of all those issues, a prairie helps to determine what the bargaining zone is so that you end up coming to an agreement that is exceptionally favored to you and not something that is subpar. So distributive and integrative. So let's talk a little bit more about that. Taking a distributive negotiation and I made it integrated by adding, I took a distributive negotiation that I was trying to make and I made it integrated by adding additional issues that came up during our meeting for the movie Godzilla. And then I was able to uncover that additional issue by developing a rapport with the people, about 6 people I was sitting around the table with. One from, at the time, Paramount Pictures, another executive producer from the film company that was actually half the film that was being produced, and the location managers, 2 location managers, and then there were 2 top producers that were in the room that was producing the film. And so sometimes when you don't have that rapport and you don't have that trust, people will keep their problems close to the vest. But some type of way, I was able to, by being planning for what the questions may be or may not be, and bringing by putting that presentation together and writing out my planning document, it helped me to see some things that I needed to focus on to bring those things that came up that I didn't know anything about to them to say, here's how we would incorporate that whole thing. So this is how I got into the movie industry by happenstance on something I was trying to offer otherwise, but it became a more of a integrated process where I was a person at the table. My company got to sit at the table and got to sit at the table at more movies, movie after movie after movie, and some of the best movies that have come out of late. So sometimes when you don't have that rapport, again, you don't have that trust, people will keep their problems close to the vest because they think you might take that information and exploit it or use it against them. But instead, what I did was take something that was just about initially on the face getting a deal, the face of just getting a deal, such that I could move my business forward and make it a much bigger thing that I wasn't claiming value to. I was actually creating values for all parties, which I constantly do. And so that is successfully turning a distributive negotiation into a integrative negotiation. So, so what about understanding the nature of the negotiation? One of the characteristics of negotiation is that I was in getting Godzilla, is the notion of recurring negotiation. So once I got in with the movie industry, I didn't just get in for myself. It opened up things for my family as well and my friends to be able to get into an industry that wouldn't have had a door open. And it also opened me up to the Academy Awards and the awards for the various groups that I had opportunity to meet with. It opened me up to state and local agency. It was a huge, huge opportunity for our company. Wasn't money necessarily on the table, big deal at the time, but it was those meetings and connections that were happening that was a big deal. Sorry about that. So working with the executive producers is a long-term negotiation. And so when there's going to be a long-term negotiation or reoccurring negotiation, that's ongoing relationships and are exceptionally important because the circumstances can change, and they were. So those producers always knew, because they had value, skin in the game. They're the ones raising the capital for these movies, the executive producers are. And so they want to make sure that their capitals are in sync. Security provides that security and making sure that they're going to cover losses if something gets stolen, it's a lot that goes on in that process for the security team. And so that relationship allows for the trust and the sharing of information. I can't imagine what would have happened not if I hadn't had that relationship and hadn't developed that relationship with those executive producers. So understanding the nature of negotiation. Now, so for integrated negotiation, that's the notion of really trust is really important, and it really is. But not all negotiations are this way. Some are distributive in nature, where it's all about the claim of value. And so if you're going to buy a car, right, that's a distributive negotiation. And if you're never going to see that person again, and you're just there trying to get that good deal, and well, that relationship isn't quite as important to you as it may be in another in an integrative situation. Mm. Uh, so, I mean, a distributive, so in an integrative negotiation, distributive is one way and integrative is a combination. So, what about salary negotiations? And this is what a lot of people ask me about, and this is what I speak to a lot of college grads about. Salary negotiations should be integrative, but most people view them as distributive in nature because of the way you just described them, excuse me, on the previous monitor. And that is, instead of describing it as negotiating the entire job, people describe it as negotiating the salary. The salary is going to be a fixed pie. Your gain is going to be my loss. My gain is going to be your loss. But when we think about job negotiation, it's not just about salary, it's about the whole pie. It can be also about options and location and title and responsibility and the ability to move up within a certain period of time and moving expenses. So it is a lot involved when you're thinking about salary negotiations, not just the money, even though we focus on salary, it's the big picture, the pie, the job. And so when you think about negotiating the job, you're negotiating that package. And that package has the potential to be integrative in nature. But when you're just talking about the salary, and it's how much money really that you're looking for, you just get purely distributive negotiations. But I think something that you're highlighting, though, we're highlighting here is that it's the notion of distributive negotiations and integrative negotiations. They are embedded in these relationships, and that's because a bit of difficulty, because there is this pull and tug between, wow, I want to get as much money as I possibly can, but I also don't want to offend the person who I could potentially be working for or with in the next 10 to 15 years, for the next 10 to 15 years. And if this goes wrong, I may lose this job. So that's when we talk about interdependent decision making, because I can't do this by myself. I'm dependent upon the other party. That's when all that anxiety comes up, right? And so we want to think about negotiations more strategically, more analytically, just to make sure that we help to manage that process, reduce that anxiety, and increase our confidence. So negotiations as a woman. So being assertive and being direct, that is something that has as women, we tend to love or have to manage, because those perceptions of those stereotypes are ever present. Let me say that again. Because being assertive and being direct, that is something that as women, we tend to have to manage, because those perceptions and those stereotypes are ever present as it pertains to women, especially women in leadership. It would be fantastic if we live in a world where that was not the case, but it is the case. Not everyone will perceive these as negative, but some people will, which means that we have to manage those perceptions accordingly if we're going to develop those relationships effectively. Not damage those relationships and ultimately get the type of deal that we would like to get at the end of the day. And so when you think about this notion of being very direct, I think you have to also step back and say, what exactly does that mean to me? What am I trying to do here? When I say that I am direct, I am being direct in what way and in what capacity am I being direct on? Does that mean that I'm asking specific questions? Well, that's not a good thing, right? So we have to be careful. So even though we want to be direct, we have to recognize, one, how we're being perceived and manage that process. If you feel as though the other person is on their heels and they're light and they're like, hey, then you probably need to alter your communication style and pause a little bit and see what they're thinking about, see what they're reaching or reacting to, as opposed to just kind of going and going and going and going and not stopping and still keeping that same direct mentality. So this is all about managing that process. A priority is that planning document, and you're direct, and you know you're negotiating with someone else who is direct. This should be fine, but a direct person negotiating with an indirect person that's not direct is not okay because it offends other people. But if you're direct and you're negotiating with someone who needs to take their time, that relationship is exceptionally important. That's they want to get to know you a little bit better. It is probably in your best interest not to circumvent that process, because that could be a detrimental at the negotiation table. So this notion of really preparing for the negotiation, not just about the issues, but thinking about who that person is on the opposite side of the table as you are also goes into the planning process as well. And to be clear, I am not in any way saying don't be authentic, don't be yourself. I'm simply saying we have to manage this process. We have to manage it in such a way that we put our best selves forward and people perceive us as in a way that we intend and not in a way that could be adverse to the negotiations outcome or our career outcome. There are numerous strategies that we can have at our disposal. Sometimes taking a break and then coming back and having a reset, it works. Another alternative that can be very helpful is labeling the process, meaning, did I come, meaning, did I come on too strong? Or if I did, that wasn't my intention. Tell me what you're thinking about and what I just said. Disentangling, right? And personality, that personality from the content of what has been said. And by labeling the process, we can easily do that and bring some things down to par. So that way, people are responding to the issue, the content of what you said, and not the manner in which you may have delivered it. And labeling the process can be a second way that can help to get you back on track. Now, sometimes if for some reason you are so emotionally entangled or you're communicating in such an assertive way that it can derail the effectiveness of the negotiation, then that might be the time that you actually bring in a third party, or you bring in an agent to talk on your behalf. And ladies, this is also retains to relationships as well. Sometimes we have to bring in somebody else to help us through the process. Because if we can't disentangle the emotion or the assertiveness or the style from the issue, and sometimes when it is our baby, right? When it's our business, that can be difficult, very, very difficult to do. So it may need to be that we bring in someone who can speak for us and disentangle those styles. So whether number one, you can step away from the process or you can take a break. Number two, you can label the process. And number three, you may need to bring in someone else so that we are just a few tips that you can have at your disposal, or tricks of trade. So let's talk about emotional intelligence in negotiations. So communicating emotions can have a positive effect because it can convey how passionate you are about certain issues. And so to get what we want, we have to ask for what we want. And people have to understand our preferences. And emotions can be a fantastic way in communicating what is or what is not important to you. On the other hand, communicating emotions can have a negative effect as it can hinder one's ability to make good decisions and can undermine your credibility. Also, it's really important to make sure that emotions do not become integral in the decision-making process and the negotiation process. That if they are, they remain tangled. And one way to do that is to distinguish feeling your emotions from conveying your emotions. And that's really important. And sometimes we can't do that. Sometimes I don't do that well myself. Maybe or many people don't do that well, but at the negotiation table, you feel what you feel does always have to equate with what you say, right? It does. It always has to. So because negotiations are in a constantly state of managing emotions and being in touch with your own emotions and perceiving others' emotions can be an extremely important part of the negotiation process. And if this is something that people tend to struggle with, I kind of hate to use this term because it's one that's probably overused a little bit, but that is be in touch with what emotional intelligence is. And the 5 steps associated with emotional intelligence, and it's something that's been studied for a long time. So it obviously works. Along with emotional intelligence, I'm a supporter of psychological capital, hope, optimism, self-efficacy, which is knowledge of self, and resilience. So people have brought it into the negotiation arena as well. But the notion of self-awareness, self-regulation, self-motivation, empathy, and ultimately building great social skills at the negotiation tables, those are steps that are involved in proving our emotional intelligence. And that can also be a way that we feel our emotions, but not necessarily convey them. The other thing I would say is I don't want to make it sound like conveying emotions is always negative. There really is a balance. So, for example, some of our research says that if it's not just about the emotions that you can feel naturally, right? But you can actually use emotions strategically at the negotiations table. So, the emotions in negotiations have been studied quite a bit. And so we know that when we're in a positive mood, that's when we're more creative, right? We're more creative when we're positive. It just works that way. But we know also there's a distributive negotiation that when we're in distributive negotiation, we may need to be a bit more rational and a bit more poker face. So sometimes when we're trying to claim value and we've been at the table for a long period of time, well, sometimes we need to throw a little negative emotion in there. There are so many layers to emotions at the negotiation table that it really should be one of those things that we think about when we're preparing negotiations. So, again, thinking about this notion of personal, yeah, this is my baby, this is personal. Know what your triggers are. Practice how reactive to those triggers you are. If you know that when somebody says this, it's going to make you react in this way, and that's not the way that in which you want to react, then you probably need to practice reacting in a way that you would like to react, such that when those triggers come up, in the negotiations, you're prepared for them because they will come up, and you need to prepare yourself. It's like acting; you have to prepare yourself, and you are choosing your feeling and emotion, and then you choose whether or not it is in your best interest to convey that emotion. All right. So perception and fairness. Let's talk about that for a minute. Fair can be based upon need now. It can be based upon precedent, inequality, inequity, things of that nature. So first, when you think about it, my triggers is when people say that I'm not being fair. Step back from that and say, how might my definition of fairness be different from their definition of fairness, right? You got to know. And perhaps that would be incorporated into your process and say, this is something that's really important to me. And I define fairness as this. How do you see fairness? Do you do your fairness? Do you do fairness in the same way in which I do? So if you know that's going to be the trigger, and it may come up during the design, that in your negotiation, you might want to design that in your negotiation process up front, right? So thinking about those things, a query and addressing them can be go a long way in making sure that these triggers don't derail your negotiation process. It goes back really to the notion of one of the most important things to consider, the perception, perspective, or perspective of the opposing party. How do they see things? When we're prepared for negotiation, one of the reasons that we tend to not ask for what we want, or one of the reasons why we tend to negotiate against ourselves, is because we only perceive our perspective. We know how desperate we are and how we want it. We never consider that the other party may be in a comparable situation. And so, thinking about everything that might be our trigger, think about what their trigger could be as well. So, this asymmetry of focus and preparation of negotiations only on ourselves can be our determinant. But the power comes from when you're actually also considering the other person's perspective and their position and why they may have the position that they do on this particular topic. So we're winding down here. I'm sorry, I went a little bit too fast. Can you strategically use emotions in negotiations? Some may ask me or have asked me. First, it depends on the type of negotiation you are engaging in. That's number one. So let's just kind of get that diagnostic over with to the side and out of the way and say that, this is the consideration in terms of whether you should or should not. So whether to reveal what to reveal is not as simple as yes or no decision. It's not. But it usually depends upon the situation and the type of negotiation that you find yourself in. Now, for many negotiators, their initial response or inclination is to reveal as little as possible as to not to be taken advantage of or exploited by the opposing party. Now, if we step back and think about that negotiation tactic to reveal as little as possible, it is something counterintuitive, to the ultimate goal of the negotiation. So if the goal is to get a deal that is favorable to you and your circumstances, you eventually have to ask for it. That's it. You got to ask for it. And you can't stay on the sidelines and not ask for what you want. You're going to eventually have to share information which goes in the opposite, right? That's completely opposite of keeping things close to your vest. If we don't reveal our preferences and priorities, we may not get them. So now, if we think about why we feel the need to hold our information close to the vest, it usually arises from our lack of trust that we have towards the other party. And in turn, that lack of trust that we have for us or they have for us. And so one way to build trust is to actually by sharing information. That's how I meet people. I share information. That's how most people meet people, is by sharing information. And so if you don't have a reason not to trust, then trust and share the information. And usually the norm is reciprocity. And they will be relieved and they will start sharing, meaning they'll share also. Not just to be clear. Now, just to be clear, it's not always the case. There's a Russian proverb that I heard the other day that was made famous during the Reagan era, and it was called trust but verify. Trust people but verify. And so now in that situation, you do this. You use the same tool of sharing information, reciprocity, but you don't share something big. You share something little, and then you verify, and then you build and build and build. And then usually the person will share something little with you as well. So can you share? Absolutely. Not everyone is going to have your best interest at heart, though, when it comes to emotions. Some people will perceive that as weakness. You have to know and you have to see, and you have to diagnose the negotiation to determine what it is and what is appropriate. And sometimes what you may want to do is, as a strategy, I don't hear people talking about this a whole lot, but this is something that was pretty popular a few years back, and that's the notion of post settlement settlement. And that's just simply means that sometimes the goal is to get the deal, okay? Get the deal first, and then you can talk about other things after the deal. You want to get the deal, but sometimes when you get the deal, it's not the best deal. But you get a deal and you can always fall back on that deal. But if you were to share some information after the deal that has been made, maybe to the extent to which you might um, be desperate, for example, that could work for some people. So you sign some kind of deal, it's subpar. And even though they say, if I had done this with the movie industry and it was subpar, but getting to know each other, being acquainted with each other, that was the key ingredient for our negotiations. So in closing, negotiation skills are life skills, guys, and they can be beneficial in numerous aspects of our lives outside of our deliberate context. All right. So I hope you got a little more information from this whole negotiation process and you understand it a little bit more, and it helps you out tremendously. Take care.